Hello, I'm Joe Chamberlain, the Executive Director of the Coastside Land Trust in Half Moon Bay, California. Welcome to the next webinar in our series of informational educational programming to do with our beautiful and precious and fragile open spaces. I'll get to our introduction in a moment, but I'd like to start with a few logistics for the day. This webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to you with a link in the next 48 hours. In addition, it will be posted on our website, coastsidelandtrust.org, and it will be there permanently so you can watch it and share it as you please. The presentation will be about 50 minutes long. And then our interviewer, our master interviewer, Kate Dickey, will come on and will take your questions and have Gray answer them. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little two little talkie boxes, and it says Q&A. So if you could put your questions in there, and Gray and Kate will make sure that they are answered for you. If we don't get to all of them today, we often do a follow-up email to make sure that we've covered everything for you. Let's see. So the next thing is, these are free webinars, but our organization runs on donations from the public. And if you are able to make a donation to us, please go to our website and make a donation. So today we have the famous Reyes from the Central Coast here where we are, and he's dedicated his life to caring for, understanding, learning, and sharing his knowledge about our beautiful open spaces and how we have a responsibility to care for them. He's done a great amount of education, and he has spent his life dedicated to this, and I hope you will visit his blog. He has wonderful information there, and we'll share a lot more information than what we'll see here today. So Gray, if you'd like to add a little more about yourself before we get started, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
And welcome.
Thank you, Joe. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thanks to the Coastside Land Trust for your work with conservation in our area and preserving our open spaces, and then also particularly for helping educate the public about these important things. I will add a little bit more about me. The social scientist friends say that I should always tell people before my presentations about where I'm coming from. And I'm one of those people that believe strongly that we need all species on this planet to continue living well, especially. And then it's not a barrier. We can do this, that most species are actually not lost because we need to lose them, but more because of greed or carelessness. And I also believe in what I call a re-indigenation. I think we need to become as indigenous as all the world's indigenous people were. To make this happen, we can do this if we stay put, if we don't move ourselves around as much as we do. If we dedicate ourselves to specific places, we're going to be able to make this through together with all species. And so some people say, well, really, why all species? I see riding on planet Earth with all its species is somewhat analogous to riding on an airplane where the rivets hold the plane together. I'm not sure everyone knows what rivets are, so hold tight. We also, when flying on airplanes, are super happy to know that inspectors are checking everything to make sure it's in order. On Earth, I'd suggest that those inspectors are really like ecologists or like atmospheric scientists right now, especially with global warming. We really do rely on these scientists to tell us the health of our system and what we might do differently to make sure we're making it well on the planet. So rivets are these tiny little things. You see them on the sides of planes. You can see hundreds of them holding the plane together. They look like little knobs, little bumps. And they are really the thing that holds the plane together. Like species are the thing that holds Earth together and makes our standard of living what it can be. So when you're getting on a plane, let's say one day you're getting on an airplane and you're pleased to see the inspectors doing their job, your luggage getting on the plane just like you had hoped. And as you get on the plane, you take a glimpse underneath the plane and you see something you don't expect, somebody removing the rivets on the plane. How does that make you feel? Well, you think to yourself, I'm not paranoid. I think it's probably good. You go ahead and get on the plane and you sit down and you start fretting. You hit the call button and you ask the attendant about the rivet removal. What's going on under the plane? I saw somebody removing rivets. And the stewardess, well trained for such questions, says, you know, we don't actually need all of the rivets. We feel like some of them can come out. Like some people would argue, we don't need all of the species. Some of them can be removed. How does that make you feel? And she goes on to say, well, they'll save some weight by removing, it's actually good to get rid of some of those rivets. And besides, we can save some money and recycle them. And there's some scientists that want to see what happens if we remove a few rivets. How many species can we afford to lose? Well, we already know we're losing species. The dodo, the passenger pigeon, the Tasmanian wolf are all very famous extinct creatures. How do we know what those extinctions cost us in terms of life on Earth and our own standard of living? How many species do we actually need? How many species? I'll just ask you right now. Think about how many species you need to live on this planet. And when I've asked people before, they don't really understand why I even ask that. And I say, well, look, our food, our breath, our fiber, our timber are all species. We eat species. So that's where it gets most people. And that most people say, well, we want corn, we might want wheat, we might want, how about some millet? Many people eat millet. Rice is good, want rice, walnuts are good. Oh yeah, there's pecans and eggplant and avocados and grapes. And quickly they come up with maybe 20 species, and some of them stick right there. I think we have 20 species, that's about it. Well, that's funny, because it turns out agricultural species grow in natural ecosystems. They're surrounded by natural ecosystems, and they do better when surrounded more with natural ecosystems. Pollination's better, pest problems are better when you have ecosystems interdigitated with agriculture. And every one of the species that I just showed you depends, and are scientifically documented to depend on other species just to grow, even without the natural ecosystems around them. And so quickly you understand there's this web of life, and we don't really know which species can go in order just to eat. So, the real answer, I think, to that question is we need all the species we can in order to continue living on Earth. And here in Central California, we live alongside natural ecosystems, and there's good science to show that the more diverse those ecosystems are, the more we visit them, the healthier we are as people, just from that interaction. So Coastal Prairie is one of those ecosystems. You can see it along the coast here. You can see the grasslands stand out from the forests. And just to let you know, the coastal prairies are the most diverse grasslands in North America. The most, more than the tall grass prairie, more than any other grassland type. They are diverse, more species diverse per square meter. And they're also one of the top 10 most endangered ecosystems in North America. They are the most coastal prairies been lost to urbanization of any ecosystem in North America. So there's plenty of reason for the species, especially to pay attention to coastal prairie, and let alone the amazing vistas you get when standing in it to our beautiful world around us. It's beautiful. We feel peace in these prairies. So I hope you find enough reason to pay attention here, why I'm going to talk about restoring it. Well, now, when I say coastal prairie, it's not monolithic. There are at least 3 different types of major different types of coastal prairie. If you look on these ecosystems, you see big flat expanses. These are called coastal terraces. You see grasslands on steep slopes. Those are called hillside coastal prairie. And then you see on really shallow soiled little knobs up and down the coast, like at Montara Mountain, grassy balds. So those are the 3 major differences in coastal prairie. And amongst those, at least in Santa Cruz County, if you look at species assemblages, we know that there's at least 50 different species assemblages in coastal prairie. So there's a lot to know behind the term coastal prairie. And I should say it's always within the area of coastal fog incursion. That's where the diversity really happens. And these prairie ecosystems support a wealth of wildlife that depend on those plant species. So, here's a picture of just a few of the incredible animals that depend on coastal prairie in our area. My favorite, of course, is a Loney tiger beetle, if you know me. Harvest mice are pretty cool too. And, all of these critters are amazing. We hope to maintain badger populations for reasons I'll let you know shortly. I'm going to show you a slide deck of some of the beautiful wildflowers that are in coastal prairie. And these pictures are by Dylan Newbaur and often feature pollinators that are native in these ecosystems as well. They're perennial and annual species of wildflowers. There are a lot of yellow ones in the beginning of spring, and they change color as you progress through spring. And they're not really a lot of them. You don't see big fields of wildflowers, generally speaking, in coastal prairie. They're patchy. And so people go to the desert or interior grasslands for these spring wildflower shows. And in coastal prairie, it takes a little more hunting. There's some really rare annual wildflowers in coastal prairie, like this endangered dandelion that has these puffs like the dandelions This is the Santa Cruz Mountains dandelion, Stebbins-ostreus decipiens. There's only a couple populations of those. Some coastal prairie wildflowers are like that. There's just a few populations. And so they're on the brink of extinction. Those rivets are going. And then there's really common species like lupins that you can find nice patches of in coastal prairie, depending on how those coastal prairies are managed. Lupins, I like the smell of. There's not just one. There's many different species of lupins, perennial and annual in coastal prairie. And depending on whether a wildflower is perennial or annual, it'll require different management. And there's lots of clovers in coastal prairie, nitrogen fixing clovers. Bees love them. You could spend many years just getting to know the different types of clovers and the different sort of subtypes of clovers in coastal prairie. We're sad to have lost Randy Morgan, who was a real clover expert and a real coastal prairie conservationist because of that and other things. Coastal prairies are cool with clovers, and Native Americans really depended on those clovers for salad greens. It was some of their favorite herbs to harvest for salads in the spring. So they managed these coastal prairies as salad gardens and for other reasons. I hope you're appreciating the color and diversity of these wildflowers. They're really astounding. And I hope that maybe you go out and look for these wildflowers and their pollinators. Some of those pollinators aren't even described yet. They're unknown to science, except from a few collections. Coastal prairie also rich with owl's clovers, which aren't really clovers. They're annual paintbrushes, and also a diversity of color and textures and scents, actually, that add quite a bit of richness to the coastal prairie flora. I just love the way they look. Some coastal prairie wildflowers are quite common, like Cicerynchium bellum or blue-eyed grass. Nevertheless, quite beautiful perennial iris family thing. And some coastal prairie wildflowers are just rushes that you have to look at really carefully to catch their beauty. There's a lot of native bulbs in coastal prairie, like this star lily And like these, they're called blue dicks that are coming up next. So those bulb species are also quite diverse and patchy. Now I want to talk to you about what made coastal prairie diversity, because that's really important to understand the ecological history of coastal prairie in order to inform what we have to do in the future to manage it. Coastal prairie started about 2 million years ago as an ecosystem, evolving an amazing diversity of wildflowers along an amazing diversity of what's called the Pleistocene megafauna, which included a lot of ungulates and a lot of big predators like the saber-toothed cat. If we were here not long ago, we would have seen this giant animal fauna grazing these grasslands and then moving on when they were dry. But there were, we have skeletons of these, remnants of them coming up from Bay Area sediments, not just the La Brea tar pits. They were close. There was no barrier to dispersal in every part of our coastal prairie. These animals were really there. And we can know from the fossil record that the annual wildflower diversity of California's grasslands in general increased as these ungulates appeared in our grasslands. So people say, what about fire? In coastal prairie, fire, it's a moist ecosystem. Fire effects weren't great. So I show you a line that, of less effect, lower down on the scale of fire in our grasslands during this evolutionary disturbance regime 2 million years ago to the advent of human influence in these coastal prairies. Some people say, well, that's 20,000 years ago, might have been 100,000 years ago. We can gather more information and evidence for that. Native American disturbance regime changed the coastal prairies greatly. So we went from an ungulate diversity disturbance regime with little fire to a mass extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna due to climate change, due to hunting. So ungulate pressures on coastal prairies decreased and fire increased. Native Americans, the native tribe people burned our grasslands, all of our ecosystems, all across California for manipulation of the disturbance regimes for food, for beauty, for fiber, for safety, for ecological management, for spirituality. Cultural burns happened, and they were a big influence on these grasslands. So there was this switch between disturbance regimes some time ago, up until 1791, at least around here, and most people know about that date. That was when the genocide happened, the livestock came in, and guess what? Disturbance regimes changed again. So, and weeds, I should not neglect the weed invasion that came from the old world. Lots of weeds got introduced, or continue to be introduced, exotic species. So exotic impacts on these coastal prairies really affected them. Suddenly we have a big bump in the ungulate, the grazing disturbances again, and prescribed fire. Cultural burns were made illegal. So that burning regime that lasted tens of thousands, 100,000 years, just plummeted. So what do if you're dealing with the habitat management ecosystems evolution, you have these giant changes in disturbance regimes, species are shocked. You probably, these are extinction events in plants as well as animals. What happens up until today is that now in our coastal prairies, very influenced by our culture that suggests that livestock grazing is bad, or death to grasslands, and protection from disturbance, any disturbance, fire or grazing, anything, is really good. It's like the best thing we can do is to protect areas, and that means hands off, except for some recreational effects. That's been sort of the modern look at conservation. And so, but that hasn't done a lot, and the weeds continue to appear in these areas. But what we see is now a decline in any disturbance regime. These systems evolve with disturbance regimes, and we're starting to see those rivets come out, and species like behind me, especially the annual wildflowers, are disappearing rapidly without those disturbances. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but there's a snapshot of the history. As an ecologist, I focus on biodiversity. Reyes is a mentor of mine. He is the father of defining biodiversity. Most people think biodiversity is species diversity. It isn't. Biodiversity is all of the stuff together that affects the maintenance of species. So we talk about biodiversity being structural biodiversity, like what does a landscape look like? We have structural biodiversity on the outside, like grasslands here and forests there. And on the inside, we talk about population structures and these clovers that sometimes are red or yellow or, different structure in the habitats. And then we have compositional and functional biodiversity as well. And in order to really keep all the species, we have to pay attention to management and monitoring at all of these junctures in this mandala that Reyes has presented us. And I want to lead you through that a little bit with examples. So let's start at species conservation, or we're used to that one, right? Compositional biodiversity. Most people think about coastal prairie as well. What we really want for coastal prairie from a species or compositional standpoint is a bunch grass every foot. This is what natural grassland looks like. Bunch grasses patterned across the landscape, just like in this picture. And so what we've seen is, and I've surveyed many managers around the Bay Area, and they say that land managers, and they say that their number one priority is the restoration of all native perennial grasses in the grasslands. And once they do that, once they have a grassland that looks like this one pictured here, they check the box, they've succeeded, they have celebrations, they plant the grasses at this interval, and they establish, and they're ecstatic. Mitigation measures for impacts also follow these lines. Now, Randy Morgan taught me that grasses aren't the answer, they're the problem. And so what did he mean by that? You can plant these bunch grasses like in this picture, and they can establish a solid stand, even native grasses. It's not that hard. And if you check that box, what you're in effect saying is that goodbye to the wildflowers, which is really where the diversity is. Bunch grasses will build up a lot of litter. They'll get quite tall. They compete well with everything. And underneath their root systems is this incredible seed bank of native annual wildflowers that will not be expressed without disturbance. And without disturbance, those species will slowly be lost in the seed bank due to age. So there's a problem we must think about when we think about species biodiversity conservation that I wanted to illustrate there. Let's talk about genetics as well, and some things to think about there. This is our coastal prairie poppy. This is a maritime California poppy. If you notice on the edges of the petals, it's somewhere yellow, in the center it's orange. This is, some people have described it as one of the 16 subspecies of California poppies. Now, if we're going to do restoration of coastal prairies, some people want to seed in things, and they end up seeding in poppies. Here's another picture of poppy. I hope you notice the difference in color. There's other populations of poppies interior of California. And so in expediency or wanting to help, people buy wildflower seeds and throw them around. And this is not restoration and management of genetic biodiversity. And I always say, friends don't let friends buy wildflower seeds. Please don't do it. We should work with the seeds we've got right in the places we're restoring and managing. So then we talk about on another compositional front, management and restoration of the communities and ecosystems of coastal prairie. I already mentioned there's a lot of different ones. And these coastal terraces that line our coast here, each of those terraces, and there's 5 of them at least, has an entirely different soil, different aged soil, and entirely different type of coastal prairie. In my monitoring of coastal prairie, there are different types of coastal prairie pretty much in every patch. So it's hard to know compositionally what we should be restoring, but there are these major differences in soils and the communities that exist there that we ought to pay attention to. I want to point out that there's a lot of agriculture on most of these coastal prairies, right? It's flat. It was easy to farm at some point. And then there's this other compositional difference between what are called old growth coastal prairies that haven't been tilled and secondary grasslands that were tilled a lot and then now look like grasslands, but the soil's been turned over and it's been highly disturbed. There's probably no seed bank left. Those secondary grasslands, from data collected elsewhere in the world, and we should have it here, will never be restored to old growth characteristics. It's impossible. Some species can't take that. And the carbon can never be put back, no matter what we do. Extensive experiments there. We might, like 90% of the carbon gets evaporated while tilling, and we might be able to put back 50, maybe 70% if we're really good at it. So the soils are changed for a long time compositionally. We're not nowhere close with restoration. Let's talk about functional biodiversity of these grasslands as well. So this is my favorite thinking here are disturbances in the function of disturbances in coastal prairie. So here's a graph. It's the only graph, like technical graph I'm going to show. So sit tight. So on the horizontal axis is disturbance intensity. The vertical axis is diversity. Those are species diversity. The line through the center of the graph, that dotted line, is sort of like what if you took all the species diversity of all the prairies, coastal prairies in our area, you would expect that number on average of species diversity. Now let's add in 2 different disturbances at different intensities. D1, so let's call it grazing. So if you introduce grazing to these systems and you increase its intensity, moving left to right, there's a sweet spot where you get the most species diversity with that amount of disturbance intensity from grazing, right? So let's add in a second disturbance, D2. Let's call it fire. So if you do prescribe burns, cultural burns, and you can increase them intensity up to a point where you get this maximum amount of species showing up. And but this is the fascinating thing about this graph, which was mapped from work in the Kanza Prairie in Kansas, but it holds true, we think, globally. If you combine disturbances, there's a sweet spot of emergent properties of even more species diversity than you would get with either one of them alone. And that's that area shaded under A. And of course, we can't stress enough, but with too much disturbance intensity, combined disturbances or alone, you get this shaded area below what you start losing species from the sort of average species diversity across the system. That's in the shaded area B. So we think about not only some disturbance, we think about the disturbance at the right intensity, frequency, duration, and we also think about combining disturbance regimes in order to restore and maintain the most species that we need, that we have in coastal prairies. This is an important slide from Stu Weiss, fellow ecologist working in the Bay Area. This is a fence line just to illustrate what happens with the correct intensity of grazing. That's on the other side of the fence. You get these wildflower fields, and without grazing, with grazing excluded, you start losing those things like on the side of the fence we've got here. These fence lines are incredibly valuable to learn from. They aren't great enough to let you know about the right intensity and how to combine disturbances. That picture is taken out of Coyote Ridge. You can see maybe Lick Observatory in the background here, and these incredible fields of wildflowers on Coyote Ridge. A great diversity. It supports the bay checker spot butterfly. Now let's add in badger disturbances. I've surveyed a bunch of coastal prairie, and badgers throw up these subsoils that are very poor, poor nutrients, but it's in those big badger throw soil piles that you get a lot of non-competitive native annual wildflowers eking it out because of those piles of soil. And so that's my call for badger whenever we can get it. And then you add in fire and soil disturbance and grazing, and those are the three major disturbances, and you start seeing super diverse grasslands if those things are done right. And then again, these wildflowers that come up that you've seen in these pictures that I've been talking about support this diverse array of pollinators that, that are really disturbance dependent pollinators because they're going to the wildflowers that appear with the right levels of frequencies, intensities of disturbance. Let's talk about structural diversity for a second. There's all sorts of grasslands. There's all sorts of habitat types on our Central Coast. There's some grasslands that are in oak savanna and certain things that live in that shade. And unfortunately, these woody species like oaks and coyote bush are taking over our grasslands. So we have to think about where do we want which landscape patterns on the big scale. I've traveled a lot up and down California, and there's Route 1 somewhere up in Mendocino, Mendocino County. The California State Parks owns 25% of California's coastline, and often everything between the highway and the coast up in that northern country is state parks. And they have, as they get land, remove grazing, can't really do enough prescribed fire. And those grasslands, those first coastal terrace grasslands are all going to shrubland. They get converted to shrub or forest without disturbances in between 15 and 40 years, the grasslands are gone. On the inland side of Highway 1 here, you can see a piece that state parks got more recently that still has some grasslands, but the shrubs are starting to invade. And then you can see a big grassland area that is being actively grazed by a rancher where the wildflower diversity is greatest. You could see this more, anywhere pretty much. Look at these fence lines. Here's a fence line that the UC Reserve is managing adjacent to Wilder Ranch in Santa Cruz. Wilder now, so state parks in this area has a great burn team. They're burning right up to that fence line. Guess where the diversity is? On the bird side, and the coyote bush is invading the other side. Now the university started managing that area more recently. And again, I want to point out, super important for all of these species to have attention at every level of biodiversity restoration that I've just talked about. We could talk a little bit about the elk in the upper left-hand corner. So people often say, hey, what about tule elk instead of those cows that aren't natural? Tule elk must do a lot better job of maintaining biological diversity. And there's some data from Point Reyes and Hall Cushman's lab, Sonoma State, where elk do pretty much the same thing as cows do in terms of grazing and helping the native biodiversity appear. Elk are grazers, they're grazer browsers, so they actually take nips out of the brush as well. But if you take data in these elk grazed areas, you find that they are largely influencing composition almost identically to cows. And if you look at that Coyote Ridge area that I showed you earlier, you'll find the elk hanging out with the cows preferentially. There's some kind of herd safety thing or something going on there. Elk and cows like to hang out together, at least elk glom onto the cattle herds. So elk do a great job of grazing. Their numbers do not appear to be sufficient to maintain large areas of grassland that the cows are important in maintaining right now. Maybe one day we'll have enough elk to do that. But the intensity of grazing, remember that curve I was showing you, is rarely good enough to really maintain the species diversity of the coastal prairie, unfortunately. Maybe that'll change. We hope so. I understand there may be some talk about introducing tule elk to our area, Santa Cruz Mountains. Stay tuned. We're looking forward to that. Similarly, people say, well, if badgers are so important, how do we maintain them? And I would say Great Britain has some great experience restoring and maintaining badger populations. Chris Lay at UC Santa Cruz, researcher in charge of their Natural History Museum, did some work on it. The number one explanatory variable for the loss of badgers is road density. And the British have known this for quite some time. They have created badger-proof fences along the roads, and those fences lead to underpasses that push the badgers to go across roads where underneath the road where they're safe. We're starting to think about corridors for cougars and mountain lions and landscape level connectivity. We haven't in our area started thinking about how to restore badgers, but they are crucial keystone species for that soil disturbance and perhaps more, rodent control, ground squirrel control, etc. So let's think about that a little bit. There's another little story I wanted to say here. So the Ohlone tiger beetle, a favorite of mine, is an endangered, highly endangered beetle. Now, I've mentioned several times that maybe we don't know all of the insects that are out there in coastal prairie. Some of them are undescribed. We need a lot more work on invertebrates. This Ohlone tiger beetle is described and listed by the federal government as endangered. We're trying to keep this rivet in place. And I did petition the federal government to list that one. And because I was fascinated by this, which is the Ohlone tiger beetle is only around in areas that are cattle grazed, in areas with active management, trucks driving, mountain bikes driving across the prairie, because like in that picture in the lower left with that beautiful metallic green beetle, this beetle requires bare soil in a very productive grassland. How do you create bare soil that's stable enough for it to lay eggs, raise young, the larvae feed at the end of tunnels in bare soil, and then they emerge as adults and hunt with great speed and skill in these bare soil areas. They hunt down their prey. How do you keep bare soil in a rich, moist coastal prairie? Well, they probably evolved with the Pleistocene megafauna trails, and then were aided by cultural burning and Native American trails and maybe elk trails even. But nowadays with the weeds and other things, it really takes some focused effort. And when we do that focused effort, the Ohlone tiger beetle comes back great guns. When state parks manages and moves mountain bike trails through these meadows to create new trails and then abandon old trails so the tiger beetle doesn't get run over, we've got co-management with recreationists in coastal prairie endangered invertebrates. It's pretty exciting. On the other hand, the Endangered Species Act doesn't work real well all the time to incentivize management. Usually it disincentivizes action. So we've been seeing interesting collaboration come out of the restoration of Ohlone tiger beetle. I encourage you to look at bugs and see what you might discover in coastal prairie, because there's a lot out there. The bay checker spot butterfly, I think, is in that upper left, right-hand corner. There's tons of stories about it. Let's see other pictures here. The California tiger salamander story, maybe not so much in many of our immediately coastal areas, but on the inland grasslands, this critter also, it turns out, mostly lives in cattle ponds and moves about best when it's grazed. And yeah, so it's another one of these prairie species that needs management and restoration attention. All of these things do, really. And these are just a snippet of the wildlife that we need to pay attention to. So what can you do? I've already mentioned that I urge people not to plant wildflower seeds. Please don't do it. Tell your friends not to do it. Let's stop throwing seeds around, folks. Seed bombs, seed restoration, none of that works. The pollen from these seeded populations actually does expand. If you plant enough non-local California poppies, you get what is called outbreeding depression. Now, hopefully everybody's parents taught them about inbreeding depression. What you might not know is that with enough foreign genetic material, you can actually flood the native populations with foreign genes and cause the whole fitness of the whole population to decline. And so we end up with California poppies in our natural areas around Santa Cruz that weren't native there being seeded out. They do really well in a drought year. They cross with a native species that are perennial and long-lived. These seeds are annual. They're not really well evolved for the moist coastal prairie. They get mildew. They don't really thrive in the moister times. And so all of our poppies end up getting mildew and not doing as well. And we lose that beautiful native poppy. So maybe I can't emphasize that enough, but please tell your friends. We're starting to see, like in this picture in the upper right-hand side, some parks agencies, I know Mid-Peninsula Open Space District Authority, district is starting to introduce prescribed grazing to maintain their grasslands. The cattle actually physically pull up coyote bush and some of the woody species that are moving in, and then do some of those disturbances like I mentioned earlier. What can you do? Well, help by supporting those initiatives where you see them well planned. Maybe don't oppose that kind of thing, or at least ask questions. There's too much opposition to that kind of disturbance regime. It gives public land management agencies pause to even start because of the problems sometimes the public wants to feature in those programs. Another thing is, I mentioned the importance of prescribed burns. You see these signs that say do not report. They're scary, right? If they're not in your area, it's scary to see the smoke and people burning, especially in California's burn regimes, you know, the big mega fires. But 99.9% of prescribed burns are pulled off and nobody ever hears about them. It's a tiny fraction that ever cause a problem. Prescribed burns can take care of fuels, can take care of biodiversity, species conservation, and are essential. So however we can find a way of more supporting, like with the prescribed grazing, supporting prescribed burn programs, let's do it. We need to do that a lot more for the species. Now, I say that with recognition that there are not a lot of good data about the right intensities, the right frequencies, the right heat for prescribed fires in our coastal prairies. We can do it wrong. We can do grazing wrong. We need to support an experimental approach to these things till we know how to combine and do the disturbances quite right. Another thing that people can do is to join the legions of weed warriors, because there's a lot of weeds, gorse, broom, Douglas fir, and other things that are invading into our coastal prairies. And it's physical labor, and it's kind of fun. It's a great opportunity to give back to nature. So if you can join a stewardship corps and help out on our public or conservation lands, do it. They can use your help, and the camaraderie is excellent. You can really see the results of your work immediately and over the long term. And back to the seeding. I think one thing many people can do that have land is to actually start restoring the habitats where your land is. If you own land, think about what those habitats were and do restoration. You might not need seeds. Walk around your neighborhoods and roadsides and recognize a few native species and put them in, like from your watershed, and start stewarding and restoring the places we live. You'll be rewarded by better understanding where you live and where the native species are around you. And you can watch the seasonality of change up close and personal. Watch the birds and pollinators come back and eat those seeds. It's really enriching. And I want to point out that sometimes it seems like a big burden. How do we ever do this? But it's these kinds of efforts that I'm pointing out that, you know, are many different people doing little things, some skilled people doing big things that bring back species like the California condor. Big success stories are possible. We're all working together on these things. The more people that do it, the further we will go. So I want to encourage you to do your part. Something, tell stories, manage your conservation lands with other people, manage your land better, support lands management agencies for doing disturbance regimes that work, and friends don't let friends buy wildflower seeds. So with that, I want to end with this amazing picture of of the coastal prairie at Point Reyes. Point Reyes has many types of coastal prairie and many types of really rare species right there. If you want to go see some incredible coastal prairies, that's a good spot to stop. I think this is out on out of Bull Point Trailhead. In the spring, there are actually fields of wildflowers there alongside the cattle grazing there. All right, well, that's what I've got for you. I'm going to keep this slide up and see if there's questions or comments or where I can go from here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Greg. We've got a few questions. I actually have a couple of questions of my own here. We'll see what we get to. But we have someone who was asking you about should we be removing invasive plants from these areas, from these coastal prairies?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. The answer is yes, but of course, well, you should know your plants, right? I don't know how many places I've gone where I've seen native thistles chopped up and thrown in the bushes. Some of these native thistles are quite not very common. So hopefully you know what you're doing when you're taking guerrilla action to remove invasive species. But yes, invasive species are a critical part of restoration and management of coastal prairies. On average, in California grasslands, even in these coastal prairies, every step you make underneath your foot, it's like 80% cover of non-native species. And they really are having effects to the restoration of non-competitive things, especially like these native clovers. So yes, now what can you actually remove? I mentioned woody species because they're the easier things, right? We're not going to get rid of exotic species in these grasslands anytime. And so that's why I mentioned these fire and grazing regimes that what I call ameliorate, sort of reduce the impacts of these invasive species. That's the only way we know how to do it. I hope that, yeah. Well, of course, read the California Invasive Plant Council's list of priority invasive species and focus on the highest priorities first. That's an important index.
Great. We've got a couple of questions about grazing. Ellen was asking about feral pigs. Can they provide positive disturbance event effects? And then also, she's been told that they are replacing the lost disturbance from, yeah, and also about goats. So just both of those.
Sure. Yeah. So, there's this movement across the world of rewilding, it's called. We've lost the Pleistocene megafauna. The Netherlands are real trendsetters here. They lost most of their big animals. So there's this sort of part of the ecological restoration movement says, let's rewild these areas. We don't have the Pleistocene megafauna, so let's put animals back that do kind of the same thing, right? So that's where you hear, well, let's put cows back, let's put goats back, let's put pigs, let's allow the feral pigs some movement. Let's let the turkeys do. And there was a native turkey in the La Brea tar pits just 10,000 years ago. So the question again becomes at what intensity is correct for these, like with pigs, feral animals or managed animals, because saying grazing is good is like saying, well, the weather is good, which I like weather, I like grazing. It's just a sign of insanity to say these things. So we really have to have a lot of qualifiers for how much is enough, how much is right. Now, feral pig populations have gotten out of control in areas, and you see giant areas rototilled and native species, negatively affected. Maybe there's a sweet spot where it's just the right amount of soil disturbance, like what ground sloths might have done or what grizzlies might have done. We need to think about that. The published literature on feral pigs suggests that at sort of intermediate intensities, they don't really affect the plant community composition. The seeds that are there are the ones that seed back after that disturbance. So, they can coexist, but I think we need more work there. Goats, Yeah, what do goats do? Sort of like pronghorn, they're browsers. Could probably be used at the right intensity to at least control some of the invasive or shrubby species that are invading coastal prairies. Worth a try.
Um, yeah, this is a question from Julia. She's asking, how can we get involved locally? I think just expounding upon what you've said, are there things in our area that you would recommend?
Right. So I'm parochial to a fault. And so I kind of know what's happening around Santa Cruz. Kate, you might know what's happening up around the Coastside Land Trust are there weed warriors that get organized up there? There probably are with the different organizations. I know that we need more data on where the invasive species are or what the native species are doing. There are very few records of rare species in the California Natural Diversity Database. So anytime you can go, I want to monitor a rare plant. Well, do that and file the data. There can't be too much of that. There's not enough. But as far as stewardship activities, does the Coastside Land Trust partner with people or volunteers, or do you know of other folks that might be able to help?
Yeah, thank you. And that's something too that we've been doing. For you, Julia, one way you can get involved is we do work days. So in terms of your direct connection, I think we've been working with people in the community that have been a part of or living on the coast for a really long time, and we certainly monitor these lands. But in terms of getting involved with stewardship, we're just now that the COVID restrictions have lifted, we're hosting different work days to be doing that. Responsible invasive management or non-native management. And we have the Junior Land Stewards Program, which is both we're going to be working or we work within the Wavecrest open space, but also now that's expanding with the schools. So lots of ways you can get involved depending on where you are, time-wise in either of those. So I think that's a good question too, that we can kind of add to our follow-up email or some ways to get involved, link you that way. Let's see, we have a few more minutes. Tish had a couple of the same questions that I was thinking about too, is just channeling us towards some of the sources or, your sources of more information. So I will put a plug in here because so Gray has this blog, a website where if you sign up for this website, you get, I don't know how frequently, every few days, does it vary sort of?
Yeah, once or twice a week, usually I'll add something to it that I wrote.
And I find that it's just, I mean, if listening to it in this way, as we've in this webinar, really hearing sort of things in perspective, from a scientific perspective, from when you're talking about re-indigenation, the perspective of a holistic perspective, I could not recommend that more. I feel like that has given, just personally, that has had such an impact in the way that I'm seeing things around me. Would you add on to that at all? What you would say?
No, sure. Yeah, thank you for that plug for grayhays.net. I try and do there's some farm writing and some natural history stuff and some how to get involved stuff there that I try and post. And I'm always happy to look into a subject. If you want me to write a short essay about something, drop a note because I'll do some research and write it up. If you want to learn more about California's coastal prairie, Sonoma State a few years ago put together a wonderful website on California's coastal prairie that has in-depth information about its ecology and restoration. And it's really user-friendly. So maybe we could send out a link to that, or you can all use a search engine and look for Sonoma State Coastal Prairie website, and they'll probably turn up. So those things are great sources of information. I don't know how else to find out about these things. I'm truly a believer in place, and if you can learn about, just pick a species, pick purple needlegrass, and say, just start learning everything you can about one of the coastal prairie species, and it'll really open some doors for you. There's a lot on many different species to to learn about, either from your own observation, sit in place and watch it, to the scientific published literature. It's a lot out there.
Awesome. Tony is asking about, she said seed collecting locally, is there a range distance we should be collecting to re-establish our native habitat?
Right, yeah. So Suzanne Shetler with the Native Plant Society in Santa Cruz is my mentor on this question. How local is local? Think about how far bees move. Really about a mile, maybe up to 3 miles. They're moving pollen. And so, probably better to collect within a mile of anything that's like insect pollinated. And think about the patchiness of these things, right? So sometimes they're like, in the picture, you can see yarrow, right, in the bottom right-hand corner. Yarrow, sometimes you can walk from one patch to the next of yarrow across miles, right? And so you don't see that much variation in yarrow, right? On the other hand, check out the baby blue eyes behind me. They're patchy, super patchy. And you'll see a population of baby blue eyes that's white, all of it, or with tiny little blue speckles. And then you'll go a couple miles and you'll see one that's darker blue, right? So pay attention to the variation in flower color and other things, and think about how local you need to be. But with these pollinator things like the baby blue eyes, you say within a mile. Other people say within same watershed, but some of our watersheds, like the Salinas watershed, I mean, really? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So those are some of the things I think about. I say within a mile, as a rule of thumb, is probably a good bet.
Great. And Robert's asking how, and maybe this isn't your domain, but just sort of from the perspective of the larger perspective, how can we encourage the approval of more seed collection permits?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, probably by having more responsible people. And so if a nonprofit were to say, start a program of seed collection, a group that had good relationships and good control over their volunteers or staff, then we'll have trusted relationships. Unfortunately, there's been a history of seed collection permits that get abused through, I'm going to sell the seed to anybody, anywhere, and make a profit from it. So some people are cautious about that. Over collection of plants, from digging them up or from seed collection, is a well-known conservation concern in the world. It's really driven some species to extinction or close to extinction. So I don't blame the agencies for being somewhat careful about seed collection permits and who they give them to.
Well, Julia's there's a number of people who've asked questions that are a little more local, and we want to give the floor to Gray today. But a couple of these questions, just for those of you who have these to have asked, I think we will respond to a couple of these questions in our follow-up email. Gray Hayes, thank you very much for taking the time to be here. This is, I think I can speak for a lot of people that this holistic look at it, along with practical applications, how we can be connecting with the environment, how we can, what to look for, what not to be doing, which I think it sometimes it gets complicated, right? It's very complicated for the average person just trying to do right, and lots of information. So thank you for this presentation.
You're very welcome. I encourage everybody to, if you have a choice of whether to move or stay put, stay put. Get to know your place. Take care of your place, whether it's where you live or the Coastside Land Trust land, or adopt a place and get to know it. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope for those of you who've stuck with us, that idea, that vision for just restoring and creating vibrant and ecological communities, right? And the Coastal Prairie being one of those most places and greatest, areas of greatest diversity, ecological diversity. We are, just a reminder, we will be sharing this. This has been recorded, so we'll be kind of doctoring it up just a bit, and we'll be sending it out to you either tomorrow or Monday. So look for this and answers to some of your questions and links to Reyes and his website in that follow-up email. Also to follow us on social media. We have a lot of interesting things that have just been happening. We also have just a reminder to anyone, to those of you who are really interested in our Coastal Prairie, the Coastal Trail extension, which is very related to what we're talking about here, how that's being done. We will be meeting out. We have sort of these meeting spots on the Coastal Prairie next Saturday from 10 to 12. So come out there, come ask questions, come just, even if you don't have any questions to ask, just come, we'll give you a little information on what's going to be happening there. And there's a map, we have it up on our blog. I'll send a link to that also on the follow-up email, just to keep people connected to where that exactly is. 4 different places where we'll be setting up shop. And Junior Land Stewards, they're up and running, and that'll be fun to kind of catch up on, because the squares just started and they've got a lot going on. So all of that will be coming through in social media. Lots going on right now. So keep up with our social media. And you are automatically subscribed to our mailing list. Hopefully that we do our very best not to send too much. And then just a reminder to those of you, please donate to the Coastside Land Trust. This is critical work that's being done to preserve these coastal prairie, this shared open space, protect biodiversity. And we all make a difference by contributing to that, whether we're showing up on work days, which we were talking about, or donating to help make this possible and help us monitor and run these junior land stewardship programs and the stewardship programs that are operating within our organization and on our coastside. So thank you very much to those of you who have been a part of that and have been doing that. And I encourage those of you who have not to, get on that train as well. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. Thank you, Reyes, and we will look forward to seeing hopefully many of you out on Wavecrest next Saturday between 10 and 12.
Thanks a bunch.
All right, thank you.